there is nothing that happens in the Trump administration, nothing that is important in many respects, that does not in some way dovetail with the fact that the Trump administration, members of the Trump administration, we're not exactly sure whom, but we can guess, are under investigation by Robert Mueller and an expanding crew of FBI and FBI agents and prosecutors. It's going to implicate, it could very well implicate the nomination process. It could implicate the specific choice and whatnot. And then, of course, the other element of this is Donald Trump and foreign relations. And this week, Donald Trump stood on the White House grounds, said, I have the UK, which is a bit of a mess. In other words, they have to protect him from all the protests that are going on there against him. I have the EU, which is a real problem, and I have Putin, and Putin may be the easiest, to deal with, which is really, really stunning for two reasons. Both the importance of NATO to the United States and world peace, even if I happen to believe that NATO expanded too quickly and inappropriately in the fall, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the burgeoning investigation of Donald Trump's ties to Russia. And I interviewed Marcy Wheeler this week. We can talk about that a little bit more, but I am finally attuned. I should say not finally, but finally attuned to that issue this week in particular. But give me your sense of this notion that NATO is our adversary now.
It's very hard to really know why Trump has this tremendous hostility toward NATO. I mean, it goes back a ways. He's been slamming NATO the same way he slams, China or Japan. He slams foreign countries, right? Well, with the exception of Russia. But other than that, this is part of his shtick for years, right? That these foreign nations are taking advantage of the U.S. We're the piggy bank, et cetera, et cetera. So there, that is just sort of his worldview, and he is essentially making the world into an enemy of the United States. That's how he is selling his philosophy to his followers, who are buying it, by the way. He had a couple of rallies over the last couple of weeks where he really slammed NATO hard, Germany hard, and his crowds are cheering wildly for this. This is kind of a new thing for what we used to call conservatives in this country, to be slamming all alliances across the board. And also excusing Vladimir Putin and kind of saying he's fine, we're just people, it's not a problem, et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard to know exactly what if there's anything specific happening with NATO other than that. However, it's really important to point out that Donald Trump simply does not grasp what NATO is, how it works, what the point of it is, the history that made it, and the way that it's financed. This is obvious to me. This is not a strategy. He just doesn't get it. He sees NATO as, and I'm not sure if he literally believes that NATO countries write checks to the United States for their protection. He can't actually think that, but that is the way he portrays it, as if the United States is, having to finance the protection of all these countries, and they're supposed to, pay us back for that. It's specifically pay us back a specific amount of money. Now, you could even if you want to just say, well, that doesn't matter, it's just a rhetorical tool that he's using to try and explain things to his people. And even if he's just too dumb to understand it. The thing that makes no sense about this, he keeps saying we are paying too much money. We can't afford to keep paying for the protection of Europe. They've got to step up and pay. He's raising the U.S. military budget. This might make sense if he was saying, look, we've got to cut back here, and you people have to step up. That's an argument that's even not unreasonable, right? I mean, we certainly could say.
It's an argument that past presidents have made
Sure.
on some level. I mean,
but this idea that he's and he's not just raising the military, he's raising it massively and wants to raise it even more. He has said.
Well, let me put some just numbers to this. The budget of NATO is a couple of $2 billion. It's a lot of money for you and I. The budget for the U.S. military went from $610 billion to $700 billion this year. That is a significant increase in our military spending, and completely a choice that we made. I mean, not you and I, but I mean that the United States has made. But continue. Just to get numbers, people understand the sort of the infinitesimally small amount of money that is spent on the actual budget of NATO. You could argue, and I think your point is, you could argue that we shouldn't have 30,000 troops in Germany. Well, okay, let's cut our budget.
Well, exactly. I mean, look, I get that. We've talked about that. You and I've written about it, talked about it for years. The massive amount that's spent on the American military globally is insane, and it is something that we should be talking about. But Donald Trump's not doing that. He's doing the opposite. He is raising, as you stand. I mean, that's a massive raise in the military budget, and yet at the same time he's saying, well, but we have to pull back from Europe and South Korea and various other places. I mean, this literally makes no sense, and I don't think there is a strategy to any of this. Now, people are taking advantage of this in various ways, right? His incoherence does help certain people in the United States. Military contractors, they're great with it, right? I mean, you've got the whole military-industrial complex, hip, hip, hooray. A lot of money's going to be spent on, a total nonsense. They're going to be building weaponry that we don't need. They're great with that. And there are foreign actors who are also happy with Trump's incoherence on this, one of which, of course, is Russia, very hostile to NATO, always has been. NATO was formed as an alliance to stand together against Russian aggression. So, of course, they have a long tradition of hostility to NATO, and most recently, with the expansion of NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union, even more hostility, right? So, there are places and people who are using Donald Trump's total incoherence here to their advantage. Right. And so you can find some places where you can see that what he's saying has some strategic sense for someone, but as an overall strategy, it is totally incoherent and makes no sense. He simply refuses, or I can't even explain how a person could be this dumb. But the idea, he seems to think that they have to spend 2% of the GDP, or as he said at the NATO meeting this week, now he wants them to pay 4% of GDP. Just said it out of the blue, and everybody's going, what? I mean, it's a lot of money for any country. 4% of GDP is a lot of money. And he seems to not understand that is the amount of money that people pay for their defense, period. And the U.S. is the same way. The vast sums of money that we're paying, we're not sending it to Germany. It's for the American military, which is then, that's the part of that's our alliance requires us to then commit our military to common defense with these countries that we're in the alliance with. That's it. I mean, we're not sending, no money is exchanging hands here. It's not like there's some kind of a transaction. But that's how he sees the world. So this whole thing is very, very incoherent, but it is so unsettling.
All right, well, Heather, we got to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about his incoherence on this trip. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. We'll be right back with Heather Parton or Digby.